We're gathered here today to take advantage and to congratulate the authors of this just hot off the press book, of which Ward carried 10 copies, and he's selling them at a huge discount. But we don't have credit cards, so they're $20 each, and I can help you if nobody has cash on them. If I trust you, I'll forward you cash. But I highly recommend, it's literally not even available yet, I don't think. And they are the authors. It's an amazing book. I read it in PDF. It's many, many years in the making. And they will talk about that, but it's not the only thing that both of them do. Ward is at Leiden, and I never can remember how to call it. So.
No, the institute has a difficult long name, KRTLV.
And he's a researcher. He's done both research in India and Indonesia, but recently a lot on Indonesia. And he's written books that are, I forget, I didn't write down.
On Hindu Muslim violence in India.
Sorry, violence. And Ed Aspinall, almost all of you know. He is at Australian National University, political scientist, long-time Indonesianist, and has a long list of books and articles to his name. He wrote a very important book about resistance to the New Order years ago, and has written about conflict areas, money politics, you name it. Ed has written about it, and he's doing a book now on women candidates in this election, and they're also, both of them are working on palm oil issues in political economy. Is that good enough?
Very good, thank you, very nice.
So with that, there they go.
Thank you. I'm doubting for that thing if I should stand, but maybe I'll do. You tell me if I should move. Okay, so first of all, thanks for being here, but particularly a special thanks to Margaret and the New York Southeast Asian Network for putting this together. This is really, for us, a special occasion because this is actually the first real launch of our book. And the book, it's just a week since we be able to touch it ourselves, so we just have it in hand. I was starting a research project on election campaigns in Indonesia. And Ed was at that time starting a project on money politics together with other authors in different parts of Southeast Asia. And we realized that our material was going to be complementary, and we also had similar aims, so we decided to work together and put both the material and conclusions into one book, which has been a process I feel has been much more smooth than I expected. It's been really nice and easy to work together on this book. I hope the readers will read that in the end as the result of this. And it was motivated by, I think, a shared desire that we wanted to make informal dimensions of politics really a key prominent feature of analysis of Indonesian democracy. Not just as something that's a deviation from how politics or democracy should work, but more as an integral element of what politics is actually about. And in that light, we endeavored in this book particularly to study politics and the informal dimensions of it comparatively. So to look at what's different about how Indonesian democracy functions compared to particularly India and in Argentina. Those are our two main comparators. To do that, we basically put two bodies of material together. One was fieldwork on election campaigns, which we both conducted. In 2013 and 14, I spent about 14-15 months following election campaigns in three provinces, in the city of Tangerang, in Lampung, South Sumatra, and in a district in central Kalimantan. Three areas with different economic characteristics. And Ed built, first of all, on his years-long studies of politics in Indonesia, but he, for this project, went around visiting dozens of districts across Indonesia and using often local researchers who, for the money politics, were also already following and studying election campaigns. So that was really the qualitative material where we tried to immerse ourselves in networks, follow gossip, see who was supporting who was angry with whom, for what reason. So really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of election campaigning. The second body of material that went into this book was an expert survey that I did also in 2014, where we worked with local researchers, mainly university staff from universities across Indonesia, whom we asked to interview experts of politics in 38 districts across Indonesia. So these were journalists, NGO activists, campaign organizers, and local academics. Basically people who follow politics, local politics professionally. And we asked them about the character of election campaigns, but then particularly about this key term in our book, which is clientelism, which is the phenomenon of exchanging personal favors for electoral support. And that could take a wide range of forms, from the more well-known vote buying, offering money or consumer goods in exchange for a vote. But clientelism also encompasses providing public services in a way that it's perceived as being contingent on voting behavior, or providing campaign donors with contracts or business opportunities in exchange for funding the election campaign. So an exchange of favor. And so with that expert survey, we tried to gauge, we used assessments of all these experts across Indonesia to gauge how common are clientelistic practices really in local politics. How often how common is vote buying? How often are contracts being handed out to campaign supporters? To get an assessment of how common it is, and also whether it varies across Indonesia. So that's kind of like the material that went into the book, and now I'll hand over to Ed to start our discussion of the findings.
So, let me just get rid of that. So one of the things we try to do in this book, well, first of all, we begin from the observation that clientelistic politics, the sort of politics that Ward has just briefly sketched out, is in fact really common around the world. You know, that politics based on the exchange of material goods, contingent exchange, as Ward explained it, is actually a very common form of democracy in many countries, democratic countries, both new and established. But one of the things we wanted to do was to think about what's distinctive about this form of politics in Indonesia. How is Indonesia distinguished along these sort of lines from other countries that practice clientelistic politics? And the sort of conclusion, or one of the terms we use in the book, is that is to think of Indonesia as practicing a form of freewheeling clientelism. And just to start us thinking about this, let's take a look at these familiar-looking characters. These are photos, I think, from the last presidential election campaign. Prabowo and Jokowi, of course. One of the really, you might notice it by just glancing at it, but one of the distinctive features of these images, when compared to presidential campaigns in many countries around the world, is a complete absence of party logos or party symbols, even party names. And this is really, we think, reflective of a general characteristic of Indonesian politics. Although there are certain features of Indonesia's political system which ensure that parties are quite important. For example, only party-nominated candidates can run in legislative elections. To register as a candidate, you can't be an independent, you have to be nominated by a party. But nevertheless, we feel that Indonesian politics, Indonesian clientelistic politics in particular, is really characterised by the weakness of parties. And here we have an image of a party office. I think you took this, did you, Ward? Yeah. During the 2014 general election, so it's sort of at the height of an election campaign, and you can see it looks pretty dead, pretty isolated. And both of us have had this experience of visiting party branch offices all around Indonesia, and they're basically empty places. They're not the sort of hubs of activity that you would expect with a party-based polity, and in fact they're really, really different. And I have Ward to thank for really zeroing in on this issue, because a lot of Ward's previous research was based in India, where party offices really are quite central hubs of community life. If you want to get something done, if you need help dealing with the local government, getting a relative into hospital, getting access to a community welfare service or whatever it is, very often in India you'll go to these community-based party workers. In Indonesia that's really rare. If people need that sort of help, they won't go to a party activist. They'll tend to start with maybe their neighbourhood head or their village head, those sorts of people who can then offer them a bridge into the government bureaucracy. So, sort of running through as a thread through the book actually, therefore, is this comparison of Indonesian-style clientelistic politics with India, in particular, which Ward knows very well, but also Argentina, which is sort of there's a lot of literature on clientelistic politics in Argentina, and that's also a country in which clientelistic exchange is really strongly associated with party organisation. Party workers provide access to ordinary citizens, to welfare services and so on in exchange for their votes. Indonesia, it's really different. So, in the absence of political parties offering this connective tissue between politicians and ordinary voters, what is it then, or how are election campaigns organised? And the answer is that political candidates tend to rely on informal networks and brokerage structures, so organisations they establish themselves, consisting of brokers who are recruited through personal ties, which are normally known as success teams. And they reinforce these success teams and build relationships with communities and voters by distributing patronage, by distributing either individual payments or community gifts. But very distinctively in Indonesia, these tend to take the form of one-off transactions at election time, rather than, say, in the Indian or Argentinian cases that we used to compare with. Often if you're close to a party, you'll get access to ongoing benefits, for example, preferential access to pension payments or what have you. In Indonesia, payments tend to be one-off, one-shot exchanges at election. So just to illustrate this, this is from a sort of a campaign book organised by a candidate in a part of central Kalimantan, which I visited. It's probably a bit hard to see, but he's basically divided his electoral district up into the various villages, and these lines are showing the places where he has recruited local community leaders as members of his success team. This is another page in the book, and again, I don't know how closely you can see that. But here he's divided the electoral district into different sub-districts, and in the various villages he's named the people who are the heads of his success team. They've gone out and collected a number of votes of people who've committed to voting for him, and then he's made corrections. He's made an estimate of the total number of votes he'll get in that electoral district. And that's very much how Indonesian election campaigns tend to be organised. Every candidate organises these personal success teams. They're often completely de-linked from the political parties that nominate them for office. And the critical thing here is these are really networks that are based around personal ties. So typically, like a candidate at the district level, we'll select a limited number of friends, business associates, relatives as sub-district coordinators, who will in turn recruit their friends as district coordinators, as village coordinators, who will in turn select their own friends or relatives as hamlet coordinators, neighbourhood coordinators, and so on. So you get these massive pyramids, which can be many, many thousands of people involved, but all being associated, being recruited through personal connections. The result is, of course, that once you go from here to here, there can be this really attenuated chain of personal connections, and a lot of the sort of the tight relationships that bond the candidate to the higher level coordinates get really kind of stretched out and lost towards the bottom. Getting back to this this particular candidate in central Kalimantan. So we have the book, with the first page showed the brokers he was recruiting in the various villages. He then tries to bind the support of those villagers through various forms of community gifts. And that's another really distinctive feature of elections in Indonesia. Massive distribution of not only individual payments, which we can talk about in discussion if necessary, you know, individual cash payments to voters or individual gifts of cooking oil or clothing or other items to voters, but also donations of community benefits. So the candidates try to recruit people who are influential in their own villages, in the villages in their district. Often they're influential because they're a head of a group of some sort. They might be a village head or a hamlet head, or they might be a local religious leader, or they might be the head of the village community women's welfare association, whatever it is. And in exchange, they provide various rewards of various sorts to those groups. So here, for example, he's been listing the gifts he's distributed around in the various villages. The first one, for example, 5 Polytron televisions and antennas, 1.5 million rupiah each, and he totals up the sum. How many is that? 7, mesin potong rumput, what's that? Lawnmowers, grass cutters, water pumps and hoses, generators, and then donations to various religious or houses of worship. So to mosques, for example, 8 donations of 500,000 rupiah each. To churches, a similar number. And then on the next page of this book, he estimated the number of votes that he would get through this process. So that you find that, for example, 5 televisions for 5 villages times 5 votes, 250 votes. 3 generators for 3 groups times 50 votes, 150 votes. He adds it all up, doing the same for all the gifts he was distributing, and estimates a total number of about 7,500 votes. So you see the process. I mean, this candidate was unusually systematic in how he was keeping a record of this, but this is the basic logic of many, or most Indonesian election campaigns. So binding the brokers that you have and the voters those brokers have within their own personal networks to you via distribution of these one-off either community or individual gifts at election time. And another result that we see, therefore, is that on the one hand, you get the politicisation of social networks around elections. So because candidates are looking for alternative channels to connect them to voters outside of the parties, they tend to use whatever sort of social network they can utilise. Really common, for example, you see candidates making use of religious organisations and networks of various sorts. Majlis Taklim, religious study or prayer groups, for example. But really any sort of social network can be linked into a success team at election time. I mean, I've heard, in, where was that? Laura, I think it was, for example, there was an not an association, but an informal network of local punks, which became part of the campaign team of a candidate who was not, well, by no means a punk himself. And here's another good example. This is from Ward's research, and this is a character we sort of follow throughout the book based on Ward's research. He was a candidate for mayor in Tangerang City. He'd been the deputy mayor prior to that. And again, you see this campaign of his election campaign, and rather than symbols of the political parties that support him, you get all these sorts of odd community organisations. I think there were like rubbish recyclers and imam from the mosques and farmers and all sorts of people. So again, it's really very typical of Indonesian election campaigns. So just to summarise then, these are some of the key features of Indonesian-style clientelism. Parties playing a limited role, social networks being politicised and really instrumentalised. Because parties are weak, so parties don't have the capacity to sort of maintain these relationships between voters and the state in the periods between election campaigns. We get a big emphasis on vote buying and distribution of club goods. So this kind of frenzy of gift giving that accompanies Indonesian elections is very much, we think, related to the weakness of parties. Bureaucratic networks are important during election campaigns also. This is something I haven't emphasised yet, but is quite prominent in the book, that very often, and in particular incumbent candidates, will really rely on the bureaucracy and the sort of low-level interface between the bureaucracy and ordinary citizens, people like village heads, neighbourhood heads and so on, rather than party networks. I'll just summarise this part pretty briefly. We do make an argument in the book about where this system has come from. You know, where does this distinctive form of clientelistic politics come from? What caused it? And it's really a two-part argument. So on the one hand, we emphasise the origins of contemporary Indonesian democracy in the authoritarian period, the New Order period that ruled Indonesia between 1966 and 98, when Indonesia was described by many scholars as a bureaucratic polity, i.e. a governmental system that was very much, again, not really based on a political party. There were the government did have a party-like organisation, Golkar, to contest its highly orchestrated elections. But Golkar was really just the election period face of the bureaucracy, and the government really ruled the country through its bureaucratic machinery. And the result is that since the transition to democracy, a lot of the discretionary authority over the distribution of state resources still really rests deep within the bureaucracy. And political parties have had limited ability to capture control over the sort of state resources that are used to build relational forms of clientelism. And we see a lot of different manifestations or results of these origins in contemporary Indonesian politics. One result, for example, which I've already mentioned briefly, is that very often the bureaucracy gets turned into a sort of an electoral machine, especially for incumbent district head or governor candidates. Because ordinary citizens do really need the bureaucracy does have the capacity to give people access to the sort of goods and services they need. The bureaucracy then can become a very powerful electoral machine. There's a bit of variation in this across Indonesia, but nevertheless it's quite important. Where are we? The other factor we emphasise, just before I move on, the other feature of or result of this authoritarian legacy, this bureaucratic heritage of Indonesia, is that political candidates themselves really frequently have bureaucratic backgrounds. It's a really distinctive feature of Indonesian politics as well, that a very large proportion of candidates elected to especially mayoral, district head, gubernatorial office in Indonesia come up through the bureaucracy. That's something that's been noted by other scholars, but we think it's the other side of the coin of this non-party based form of clientelism that we see. And it's really unusual. You compare it to Indonesia, to a country like the Philippines, for example, where you ask Philippine politicians about how many bureaucrats get elected, and that is seen as a sort of an odd question. in that country. India is the same. We also make an argument there, or we cover in one of the chapters, particular features of Indonesia's electoral system and how these have also contributed to the weakening of parties and the origins of freewheeling clientelism, as we describe it. Those of you who had the opportunity to visit Indonesia right after Suharto fell in '99 will remember that this was a period when there was a lot of energy and excitement around political parties. That back then there were these massive colour-coded election rallies where people would all dress up in the costumes of the particular parties and so on. And part of the reason for that, of course, was the sort of the euphoria of the immediate post-Suharto period, democratisation and so on. But it was also because at that point Indonesia adopted a really party-focused electoral system. A system known as closed list proportional representation, where people would just vote for a party symbol, and then which individual candidate gets elected really just depends on the position that that candidate is on the party list. Indonesia has moved right away from that system to encourage personal voting, candidate-centred forms of voting. From 2009, in the legislative elections, we've seen the change from the closed list to the open list. So voters can still vote for a party, but they can also now vote for an individual within that party list. And the person who gets elected, therefore, it's not dependent on their position on the party list, it's what candidate gets the highest number of individual votes. So the result is that candidates in legislative elections usually think that their main competitors are people from within the same party. So there's an immediate major barrier to party building and party strengthening right there. In the so-called Pilkada, these elections of executive government heads in the regions, mayors in the city, bupatis in the rural districts, governors in the provinces, we see a similar weakening of party-based campaigning with the transition to direct elections. So no longer are, the holders of these local government offices are no longer elected by the regional parliaments, which are made up of party representatives, but are nominated by these very broad cross-party coalitions. And very often the parties are just looking at electability or cash payment when choosing whom to nominate. And you get these very broad party-based coalitions, very often in which the party just sells a nominating ticket to someone who's a bureaucrat or a business person, pretty rarely with a long association with a particular party. And then the candidates go ahead and build their own success teams right outside of those party structures. So that's it from me. So that's sort of the first part of the book, really, which is laying out what is the nature of contemporary clientelistic politics in Indonesia, and what were the origins of that system. And that's the word.
Thanks. So I'm going into basically the final two chapters of the book, which are about does the character of Indonesian politics as sketched out, does that vary across Indonesia? And if so, what would explain that kind of variation? So with that, we use partly fieldwork, but also that part is mainly written around the expert survey, which was this big logistical nightmare for me, but a big project of having all these people, over 500 people interviewed through a kind of standardized questionnaire to get their assessments about the character of local politics. And we asked them questions about vote buying, so we didn't want to use the words like clientelism or complicated concepts that wouldn't work. Rather, we tried to give them assessments that would be relatively easy. So we often use percentages, like this one. What percentage of voters is giving money or consumer goods during elections for legislative assemblies in this case? Where it must be pointed out that the assessment is actually much higher than what we know from general population surveys, where usually about 30% of the voters indicate that they got some sort of incentive. Here, the average is about here. Oh, you should do that. So about 40 to 60. And interestingly, we found, particularly in this case, there's no variation across Indonesia. If anything, a little bit higher in Javanese countryside, but rather not distinctive. This happens everywhere, vote buying, and according to the experts, it's very common. But also important to point out, the general rule is the more local the elections, the more vote buying. So when it comes to presidential elections, it hardly happens, according to those local observers. But at the same time, which I think we will see now in the upcoming elections, because parliamentary elections are also taking place, we expect those candidates to hand out a lot of money, which comes out in this survey. So that's one type of clientelistic exchange, but we also asked about other types, like this one. We asked, of all the major contracts that district government awards, what percentage is given to companies and businessmen that supported ruling politicians? So contracts meaning for building roads or schools or any kind of thing that the government spends money on. And here we see at the beginning of an interesting pattern that keeps returning. First of all, this is seen as common. That's interesting too. This kind of exchanges of getting a contract in exchange for supporting or being part of a team's success is really often part of really a business strategy of many people. You see many contractors, for example, being part of the team's success. But what's also interesting is that it's seen as not very common, this type of exchange in Java, and then much more common here in, some examples are here, Kalimantan, Eastern Indonesia, but also Banten. And that same pattern we see in this third example of a type of clientelistic exchange of senior bureaucrats getting a position or being promoted in exchange for supporting a candidate during elections. It's interesting because the law actually forbids civil servants from supporting election campaign. And in that light, you might argue that this is the most flaunted law of Indonesia on an already crowded list there, I would say. But because if you look at the assessments, really very high, about half usually would, in the assessment of the expert would say, of civil servants got their promotion because they were part of, secretly often part of a team's success. And this is causing, and we discussed this, a lot of anxiety among civil servants who feel that their career is on the line at the time of elections, that if they would either support the wrong candidate or not support, but their competitor for the position does support the winning candidate, they would risk being at what's often called the non-jobkan. So they would be not fired, but they would be out of an official position, meaning losing all the perks and status that come with it. So that's quite a thing, which is we feel one of the reasons why so many of these civil servants are actually quite nostalgic about the new order, when this kind of anxiety was not there. So again, similar pattern where Javanese cities particularly score lowest and where this is seen as not very common. Now, we asked those questions about all these seven types of clientelistic exchanges, or types of resources that you can or you might award in a contingent, so clientelistic manner, like these questions that you saw. And that made it possible to add up scores per district over all these seven types of questions. We made what we call a clientelism perception index. So an index of how common clientelistic exchanges are perceived to be. It's important to emphasize we're talking about the perceptions of these interviewed experts about how common they are. It's not a measure of their reality, because that's impossible to get. It's how common they're perceived to be by local experts. And then we added them up and we calculated them on a scale from 0 to 10, meaning 0 would mean that there's no anything that the government rewards, it's done in a clientelistic manner, it's absent. And at 10 would mean that basically you would not even get a pen from the local government without voting in the right way. And then here you see the pattern. Does that have a light? No. So I'll just point out that the lowest score we have is in the city of Surabaya, just under 4. And then closely followed by Jakarta, and there's Bandung and Semarang going up to 5. Which means not absent, it's like a middle score, but comparatively low. And the countryside of Indonesia that we surveyed, not so far behind. So also a little bit more common, but not very common. And then we have Sumatra generally in the middle, with Medan as a high scoring outlier. And then the highest scores are then in eastern Indonesia, in Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and the top scoring place we have, the winner, so to say, is Kupang, the city of Kupang, with almost 8. So this pattern is interesting also for, it shows how common it is, but also that there's quite some variation across Indonesia, that it's not a monolithic type of politics. We have on a scale of 0 to 10, we have variation from 4 to 8. So that's quite a lot in these assessments of experts. Now, what was interesting about it, what we could then do is to reflect on what are conditions that foster clientelistic politics. And in the final part of the book, we discuss with, take aim at, you might say, the general arguments about this in the clientelism literature, which says clientelism is due to lack of education and poverty and in rural areas, so basically indicators of underdevelopment. What we find, that does not really come out in any kind of statistical analysis, because the countryside in Java, for example, is quite poor, high unemployment, etc., but not very clientelistic. Instead, we find a high correlation with the degree of what we call, in a summarized term, concentrated control economies. That is, economies that that are not very diversified, that have, for example, small industry sectors or finance or trade, but that are instead highly dependent on state resources or natural resources. So Kupang being an example of a really state-driven town, where the main nature of the game really is the government offices and the projects and the contracts that they award. There is not much else in terms of economic activity. And Kalimantan, for example, being very much natural resource driven, and also that being a type of economic activity very much concentrated by either the elites that control it or the politicians that award the licenses. So we find in a statistical analysis that I'm not going to put on the screen, basically that it's not the degree of economic development that shapes clientelism, but rather the character of it and the degree to which economies are diversified. That's the conclusion of that last part of the book. Now I'll say something on the consequences of this kind of politics that we sketched in the book, consequences for the character of governance and democracy in general. There are a couple that we could maybe highlight more in the discussion, but I'm going to highlight 3 main ones that we see. One is that this freewheeling kind of clientelism that Ed discussed advantages incumbents. So we look at the backgrounds of candidates and who wins, and if you look at this table, a number of things stand out. One of them, first of all, this is already Ed mentioned, that civil servants often run, and they often even win for elections, and this is comparatively speaking a very special feature of Indonesia's democracy, and it relates to, we feel, that authoritarian heritage. But another thing that's important to point out here is that incumbents often win, particularly if you count, incumbents are time limited, they can only rerun for one time. So if we look at only the elections when the incumbent runs, he wins 63% of the elections, and then if you add up the incumbent, it's like 2/3 of the elections are won by incumbents. And we feel the reason for that is the importance of bureaucratic networks. One reason for that is the importance of bureaucratic networks in the campaigns. That if you are incumbent, you already control basically the strongest campaign network that you might be able to get. And then secondly, you control state resources that can really already you use to bind voters to you, and in the sense that you don't have to spend on that kind of community gifts that Ed already highlights. You can use government resources for the same thing. So in Indonesian democracy, incumbents are really advantaged. Second consequence is that we feel that the character of Indonesian elections really undermines bureaucratic capacity, in the sense that it incentivizes politicians to appoint bureaucrats on the basis of loyalty and not capacity. You partly saw how active bureaucrats are during elections, but the reason why this works out like this is also that there is this subterranean competition going on over control over resources, that because during the New Order bureaucrats had all the control over state resources, and now politicians really need that control for their campaigns and to hand out all these favors. So in order to wrest some of that control away from bureaucrats, they need to use appointments as a key instrument to do that. They need to appoint people to key positions that are loyal and that are willing to do their bidding, to say we're going to send this budget to that village, or we're going to hand out this contract to my team success member, etc. And that means that is a big drain on any kind of bureaucratic capacity, because you need people that are willing to do your bidding rather than are capable of doing this. And we discuss in the book some stories of how basically people with a degree in fishery get appointed to the public works department, and people that have no capacity for anything get rewarded and promoted basically because they're good at the political game. So that's the second consequence that we see. A third one, and that relates to the title of our book, is that this whole system that we discussed really generates extremely high-cost election campaigns. From all the steps in the election campaigns, candidate has to spend money, from getting the nomination and the support of parties, to building the team success, the campaign network, to then the rallies and all the community gifts, to then the final days of vote buying. You get a lot of expenses. Actually, we asked in the expert survey local experts to give assessments, and let me look it up. On average, and this varies a lot across Indonesia, but on average, the estimated expenditure for district head elections is $2.5 million. For governor, this is around $15 million. And while we didn't ask that, but in 2014, the estimate for the presidential election was about $500 million for the campaign. Now, I know here, this is the United States, that might be actually, you guys might be more used to those kind of numbers, but still for Indonesia, that's a major expense, and that is all money that needs to be amassed, collected first, and then recovered. And that money is a big drain on the quality of governance. First of all, simply because it boosts corruption, and it leads to all sorts of mind project and markup and all sorts of games with government budgets that take siphons of money that could have been used more productively. But also because it really boosts an oligarchy character of Indonesia's democracy, where basically economic elites can have their way because they buy their way into many things. And here are some examples of how in Central Kalimantan that game mainly concerns concessions for mining or palm oil plantations, where as an entrepreneur you fund the election campaigns, or sometimes you make sure you're a family member of a candidate, and then in return for that financial contribution you get licenses to start palm oil plantations and make a lot of money out of it, often at the expense of local villagers who are then thrown off their land because of this. This is really why we named our book Democracy for Sale, not because it's a straightforward purchase that voters vote buying often is a very complex business, and it's not like a purchase that if you hand out money you'll be guaranteed to get the vote. And voters do also think programmatically, meaning they think about the character and the quality of the proposals and the ideas. We find the voters often in our fieldwork actually quite savvy in knowing who's good, who's not. But rather, this whole process of the steps that you need to go to become a candidate, build a campaign network, implement your campaign, requires money in such a ways that in the end it does revolve often around that the person who is willing and daring enough to put down a lot of money is most likely to win, which is why we thought first to call the Indonesian translation of the book Democracy Vanipiro, which is this Japanese term of the democracy of who dares to pay the most, basically. Those are the main points, which brings us to some main conclusions.
Yeah, so just very briefly on the conclusions, I won't dwell on this for too long. So in the concluding part of the book, we sort of have sort of intellectual, scholarly reflections as well as the more policy-oriented ones. To deal with the policy-oriented reflection first, the system we describe has become very deeply entrenched in Indonesian politics. You know, that these patterns of material exchange around Indonesian politics, there's no... that's all right. There's no... we don't harbour any illusions that this will be easily fixed. But nevertheless, there are certain implications of our study if Indonesia does want to develop a more programmatic form of politics, you know, driven by policy competition, where candidates are emphasising more strongly things like economic development policies, social welfare policies and the like. Obviously there are implications of this sort of story that Ward told about the nature of economic diversification, that nature of local economies and how they factor into the nature of clientelism locally. Many of the reforms that Indonesia embarked upon were indeed intended initially to increase accountability of politicians to voters. You know, that the transition to both to the direct elections of regional government heads and to the open list in the legislative elections were meant to provide voters with the opportunity to individually punish or reward performing or non-performing politicians. But the result, as we've seen, has been the weakening of party politics. And it's really very difficult to develop more programmatic, you know, welfare-oriented politics, or at least more programmatically organised welfare politics in a system in which political parties are so weak. And we draw on research done by Burhanuddin Muhtadi in the book as well, just to show this dramatic decline in party identification amongst Indonesians from up around, was it 88% in 99 to below 10% now. So there's this really dramatic collapse of political parties. So there could be political reforms, and we do discuss some in the book, potential ones, electoral system reforms, even just going back to the closed list, for example, which would help, we believe would help to strengthen political parties. And that's something it would be helpful for Indonesia to consider. There's always this, you know, after every election there's a reformulation, a revisiting of Indonesia's electoral rules. Problem is, of course, that the people who are reconsidering those rules are the people who got elected under the previous system, right? So there's not a big incentive. These are the winners of this sort of democracy Vanipiro system. But nevertheless, this is an issue that deserves revisiting. In terms of sort of the scholarly mission or implications of the book, well, one of the things we really want to try and drive home in this book is the need to take informal dimensions of politics really seriously and to study them in a very rigorous and comparative way. One of the observations we make in the book is that if you take sort of standard handbooks on politics, in politics around the globe, you'll often find long chapters about, you know, different constitutional arrangement, different ways of organising central local arrangements, different electoral systems, and so on and so forth. So there's a very well established body of work that compares various formal dimensions of politics. Things like clientelism are often not even mentioned at all, or if they are mentioned, they're just glossed over very briefly as sort of deviations from a norm, which is often assumed to be programmatic, party-based ideological competition. But we hope in our book, even by sort of lightly comparing the Indonesian pattern of clientelism to that found in other countries such as Argentina and in India, that we do demonstrate that clientelistic politics, as well as being extremely common, also varies a lot around the world, and that we really do need to start taking the comparative study of this informal nature of politics, informal side of political life really seriously. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was really so helpful, clarifying. I have, I guess, one comment and two questions. So the comment is just to sort of observe how ironic and sort of this is sort of a lesson in unintended consequences, because it seems that these reforms to make it less of a party system, to open the list, to make it direct, we're all about making it more democratic and undoing the entrenched power of parties and the potential for corruption within those parties. So I wonder, when you talk about what you, I guess it is a question, but I wonder when you talk about this as a something you want to strengthen, how would you strengthen parties without sort of going back to a different form of clientelism that was based in party structures, or could it potentially be? And then the other two questions were, I was just really struck by that book that listed the gifts, and I know you said that's a little bit exceptional, but I wanted you to comment more on sort of how open and public these practices are, and whether it's just, to what extent is there any attempt to hide these forms of practice, or actually part of how they work is that everyone, obviously everyone knows they're happening. Yeah. But I wanted to talk about the publicness of it. And then the other question I had is that, think about the perception index. I thought that was really interesting, your sort of caution about that. And I wondered if you think it's at all possible that some of the difference that you see between Java and elsewhere is that in Java, some of these experts are more invested in the idea of a democracy as a successful project, whereas some of those in the outer parts of Indonesia, especially the east, are much more skeptical from the very beginning about the potential for democracy. And so their perception is a more critical perception. It's just a question. I don't know.
Those are, yeah, I might gather up, but that was a handful, so maybe we should take those
all right.
first.
Why don't I take number 2 and you go for number 1 or number
3? Yeah.
Yeah. So just the one that I'll respond to is the question about how open and public is this form of politics, and it does vary a bit. So generally, the general rule is that community-based gifting is much more open and much more public and much considered much more legitimate. But that's right across Indonesia. So candidates are often not at all concerned to hide, if they're giving a donation to a Majelis Taklim or to a women's, PKK organisation or that sort of thing. But that often occurs right out in the open, or donations to mosques and so on. That those are seen as being very positive forms of exchange, because they go to the kind of the generosity and charitable nature of the candidate, the community mindedness of the candidate. Individual gifting, Ward might have more to say on this. So in particular, the so-called serangan fajar, the dawn attack, the systematic distribution of cash to voters. My impression is that this varies a lot across Indonesia in terms of how openly discussed it is. Certainly my finding was that it's much more openly discussed in rural Java than other parts of Indonesia. that often there are, it can be quite a delicate matter to get at in some parts of Indonesia, and in fact candidates often won't discuss it. But once we got to, once I was doing research in Central and Eastern Java, it's not at all easy to initiate conversations about vote buying and how it's organised and the risks of that form of politics and so on. In fact, one candidate, she was a Golkar candidate in Blora, I think it was. She was, we met her like 2 days after the election, and she was really angry because there'd been a local television report about vote buying during the election, and some people had found envelopes with her name card and cash in them, and she said, this is slander, it's an attack on me. And it turned out she wasn't angry about the fact that her vote buying had been exposed, but because the envelopes had contained less cash. So she said they're trying to depict me as someone who's cheap.
Yeah, thanks for these questions. I think, so the first one really goes indeed to a complex debate, and something that I think is a shift in broader thinking about promoting democracy. That earlier on, the idea of strengthening democracy was that by having better open elections, you would then get better governance, because you would have empower voters and they would throw out the bad guys and reward the good guys. But now, I think that kind of thinking really did not take into account fully the informal dimensions of politics and the vote buying and all that, how democratic accountability also undermines governance because of the costs and the network and exchanges that it brings. So I think indeed, as your question kind of points at, some new direction of thinking is needed, where we see promotion of good governance more as a collective action problem, as where everybody is kind of into this system somehow, and they might not like it, but it's unavoidable. And it needs fresh thinking on how you could indeed strengthen parties, reduce the cost of elections while maintaining democratic accountability, but not seeing them as naturally going hand in hand. And your second question, well, yes, I mean, so this Clientelism perception index is in many ways a proxy for something that we try to get at, and that you could point out different ways in which it might be influenced by various factors. Some factors, other factor that I particularly tried to look at and deal with was partisanship of experts, whether when they were supportive of the district head, where they would be less underestimating the estimates of clientelism, and when they were critical, they would be overestimating. So when we selected the experts, we tried to make sure beforehand to have either neutral ones, or if we would have positive ones, we would also include negative ones. But your point is more about how does awareness about democracy and a sort of conviction that it should not be clientelistic play into these assessments. It would be interesting to look at, but if I get your question correctly, it seems to me that would actually, if that effect would happen, it would take the results even further apart, because in Java you would have a public that's generally more aware or more maybe vested in democratic ideas as we formulated, so they would be more likely to be more critical even of these practices, overcritical, compared to, say, Kalimantan, where if there would be less of those perceptions. So in that sense, they would overestimate the likelihood of clientelistic exchanges, so that results would actually be even lower. But this is difficult to look at, and to think I would argue for this, that actually perceptions of clientelistic practices, how common they are, is more than a proxy. It's actually part of the reality, because people make their decisions really on the basis of how they think things work. Right. If they think, okay, I'm getting my budget for road repair, say, if I vote for the right guy, then it influences my behavior and I become clientelistic. So the assessments that people make are really part of the behavior itself. Yeah.
Okay, so in this order, you. Sorry, I know everyone's name, but for peace sake. This is Wayne Forrest from the Chamber, so U.S.
American Indonesian Chamber of Commerce. So So I lived for almost 2 years in Central Java in 1975. I was near Solo, and I was widely traveling then in the regions between Solo and Jogja. If a village wanted to sell its products to another town, it was not easy, because to get out of that village, you needed a road. And a lot of those villages in 75 did not have roads. So sometimes you would visit a village. For me, I was researching music. And I would get to some village, I'd say, why don't you have a road, but the compound 10 kilometers from here had one. So, there's a perfect answer for that, which we didn't vote for gold card. So my question really is, now today, anywhere in that region, there's roads, right? There's no village or community that doesn't get a road in at least that part of Indonesia based on its voter profile. I think that improvement is fairly accepted, perhaps, maybe I'm wrong, but I get the sense that they're voting on party lines. It's not necessarily always the way it could be in the old days. So my really question is, I think Golkar is a stronger model, even though you say somewhat it was weak as a sort of a structure, but a lot of things that I remember and know of people, it was quite strong as a patronage network. And there were lots of, national contracts, all kinds of things. And if you were not Golkar, you just didn't get it. There was no way. So how much of that is, it seems like a lot of that still is filtered into the system, this patronage style, which Golkar perfected. The bureaucracy really functions that way today. I mean, it's still common to hear stories like the Ministry of Housing puts up public housing, but 50% of the people in the housing are Ministry of employees. And this is still going on. So that kind of, there's a scarcity, materialism aspect to so much that I really wanted to almost praise you for looking to that informal side of the political dimension, because I think it's overlooked a lot. And I would say for someone who's very culturally interested, that even culturally, that there were, we don't really get the nuance enough as researchers about how behaviors work in this political dimension, because often the tools that you're using are more formal tools, and you're really making a very strong argument for sort of going beyond that to almost somewhat of an anthropological analysis, in some way matching that with what you. So I just wanted to hear you maybe perhaps think about the Golkar question and this other thing about getting further into some of these nuances based on where people's minds come from.
Maybe we'll take Rihanna is a professor at Brandeis. What's her
Baruch College.
Baruch, sorry.
CUNY. Thank you so much for the presentations and the book. It's a very important research. Expanding on the informal activities, I wonder, one of the striking difference between this decade election this year and 2014 compared to other elections, I would argue, is social media. The use of social media and fake news, fake information to mobilize voters. I wonder if you find that media, so this mobilization through social media affect in some ways clientelism, especially since you argue that clientelism went far back to the New Order era. Has there been any changes? Do you see that it affects clientelism? And the second comment or perhaps question is it's a small one. The same picture that Karen mentioned on the calculation of how many predicted voters. It shows how they are actually very calculable and also rationalizing their actions, right? So in a way that it seems it becomes business as usual. It's not something bad. I wonder if those predicted voting voters' numbers match the actual results.
Great, thanks.
What you describe, I don't think is limited to the political area, but it also exists in other areas. A few years ago, I translated hundreds of emails from local military, police, and civil servants to the representatives of an international company operating in Indonesia. I won't say which company it is. And every one of them asked for help. It's phrased as bantuan.
No.
That could be, we need a desk, we need a laptop, we need a jeep, we need a fire engine. All the way up to the Bupati wants to make a site visit to your location. We need airplane tickets, accommodations, food, entertainment, and not only the Bupati, but the Bupati's wife, and the Bupati's son, and the entire entourage. So pretty soon, this company is paying for 30 or 40 people. That's a lot. You know, I have many stories like that, but that one specifically hundreds and hundreds. And the company involved was quite upset by this because it was running into a lot of money. But I don't think there was anything they could do about it because the quid pro quo was licenses, permits, and what you need to operate your business.
Right,
Exactly.
thanks. And do you want to, what do you want? Do you want another one or just you ready to go?
Maybe one more?
Okay, great. Anne-Marie?
Okay, thank you so much. It was really fascinating. I guess I wanted to pick up on this issue of strengthening parties. Ed, you made the point that in the early elections, the parties were strong. And I remember being in the Cendana voting district, you know, Suharto's district in the 1999 election, and everybody cheering every time a vote for any party other than Golkar was called. In Marcus's book on political parties, he makes the recommendation that so much of the problem is the lack of public funding for elections that forces parties to become clientelistic to a greater extent than they might otherwise. And my understanding is that clientelism has increased since the shift to the open list. If that's the case, I mean, I guess number one, do you think there will ever be any constituency for public support of the elections, which in theory would reduce the need for clientelism, and at least if it was funded to political parties themselves rather than candidates, could help strengthen the parties? Or is it the case that, as you indicated, part of it is perceptions, part of this whole patronage goes well back to the Suharto era, that it would just be another misuse of public funds, or how does that all play out? Great.
That's a rich harvest. Thank you very much for these questions. It's interesting to do this together. Maybe I just cherry pick my questions and then you can do what's left over. Meaning, I think about Golkar, the past, for example, Ed is, he can talk about that part. Maybe I'll start with Liana's question on social media. Very interesting thing, and something that's not fully discussed but ever studied, but which would be interesting, is how, you know, social media and content, say programmatic considerations, go together with these clientelistic practices that we discussed. So say the campaign against Ahok, which really went a lot through the social media and messaging and all that, which was, a lot of them are not clientelistic considerations about not voting for Ahok, or about identity and about you know, what's he blasphemous and all that. But at the same time, you wonder sometimes whether how these messages are spread and the network through which they work are in themselves clientelistic in nature. That leaders are co-opted and then they support certain messaging and they pass it on. I think social media is very important, and particularly your question also points out to, which bears emphasizing again, that it's not just these gifts. There are other considerations that often go through all these news and these messages, and it goes hand in hand in a way that I think we do not fully get at yet, or that's not studied how that really works. I think maybe you should do the one on predicted numbers of vote buying, because that is interesting, and I think many candidates calculate in how much they lose from that they say we have a margin error that in their thing. But we discuss in our chapter 2 a little bit on approaches to clientelism, where some literature sees it more really as a calculation, an instrument that politicians adopt, but another approach is really the culturalist approach that says clientelism is really rooted in something beyond the political system, more in a pervasiveness of certain norms of reciprocity, which are indeed often central, have been central for the social security and welfare of people, that you have a network that you know you can count on when things are bad because you've performed favors for them, and they will feel obliged to return the favor. So that kind of reciprocity is indeed an important part. That's what clientelism builds on, those kind of norms, I think. And that's why you would see them in other spheres of life. In my view, is just giving money to political parties in itself is likely just to increase the spending during election campaigns, because it would just make it easier to amass money and then you spend more. It would, of course, be good to reduce dependence on big business, and reduce the drive for corruption. But in my view, it needs to be accompanied with reforms that would just reduce the need for spending during election campaigns, which would be, for example, a much more effective and stricter supervision and punishing of vote buying, so that it becomes so difficult for candidates to engage in vote buying that they then have an excuse to voters and say, look, sorry, I would want to give you money, but it's really impossible because you see the Bawaslu breathing down my neck. Right now they're not empowered enough to really stop that kind of vote buying. That would be one, and in another idea that I've been toying with, just to give you an idea, I think it would be a good idea to integrate different elections, to integrate particularly the district head elections and the local parliamentary elections, make that one, through some sort of rule that the number one candidate of the biggest party would automatically become district head. So by doing that, you create incentives that strengthen parties, but also, because you only have one election instead of two, you reduce spending. So I think some sort of reforms like that could address the problem also. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Maybe just to start by going back to something Karen said. Is it Karen? Yeah, Karen said, I think you're really right to warn about unintended consequences of any reform, including party strengthening reforms. I mean, I think our sort of starting point is that, programmatic politics does require parties, and that Indonesia has just gone too far away from them. But we do, as well as the sort of shifting the locus of clientelism back within the parties, which I think you rightly warn about. The other potential risk of Indonesia going down a party strengthening path is political polarisation. You get more party-based competition, you can potentially get more social conflict around elections. So that's something that really would need to be thought about very deeply. Wayne's comment about Golkar in the 70s, very well made. Thank you very much. Nice to see you, Wayne. We are Facebook friends.
Right. I've been noticing your travels around the United States are quite widespread.
Yeah, that's right. So I think your point made about how Golkar worked as a patronage machine during elections is very well made, and we do have a bit of that in the book. And I think that was really important for the story we tell, in that Indonesia made the transition for democracy with this sort of template ready for the parties to learn from. And they began to learn from that very quickly.
I mean, could you say, Ed, that some of these parties are mini Golkars?
Oh, many,
Yeah, you could say that.
That's right. So if you just count up the party vote I think we do this, don't we? I think the last election, up to 50% of the vote in legislative elections was won by Golkar or Golkar splinter parties, right? So that form of doing politics has really been sort of massified throughout the election system, right? And it's not only that the party politicians learned from Golkar, but it's also community leaders did as well, I think. So village heads, for example, knew in the old days that if you wanted the road, you had to go to Golkar. That pattern of politics of approaching politicians for benefits around elections, it can be seen as really a continuation. So as a patronage machine, it's true Golkar was really strong, really influential. As a party, it was the electoral face of the bureaucracy and ABRI at that time, right? Yeah. Social media, etc. I think that's a really interesting question, and there has been such an uptake of social media over the last 5 years. It'll be interesting to see. One thing I would say is that the sort of clientelistic politics we look at really do, because they're based on material exchange, they do really require actual physical face-to-face contact, because if you're giving out money, you have to actually meet and know the person. So the way certainly my impression from last time around is that often candidates, like social media campaigns are part of what candidates often call pencitraan, so image building, right? And candidates can often really differentiate between different target audiences, and the standard approach, especially in some of the cities, is candidates will say that they'll do pencitraan, image building, for middle class voters, and that they'll do the old-fashioned, distribution of cash to poorer voters. So much so that candidates often, well, the classic was that I met one candidate in Rembang in Central Java who sent out envelopes saying he was against money politics to the perumahan, the middle class housing estate at the edge of town, and then he said, and I also sent out, it was really good, it was a really effective strategy, I also sent out envelopes to the fishing villages, and I said, with the same message? No, they had cash in them. So anyway, also the question about voters being rational, sort of, what's the success rate of this sort of distribution? And as Ward already mentioned, candidates know that they're not going to get 100% return on their gifts, and they always build in something they call margin error into these sort of gifts, but they often get it wrong. So last time when I was doing these research in Central Java, candidates built in a margin error of 50%. So you give out 10,000 envelopes of cash, you expect to get about 5,000 votes back. But in a series of candidates where we collected the data on, we were 19 candidates. In fact, the average return was only 23%. So 10,000 gifts, 2,300 votes. That was the average. So some did very well, some much more poorly. And it's sort of the more you give, the better your return is, but it's by no means an absolute relationship.
And candidates, I'm sorry to jump in just quick, candidates know that people are accepting gifts of more than one candidate, of course. Right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So there are all sorts of problems that people know about, and part of it is because, that relational nature of success teams, you invite your friends, and it's the friends, so it's the friends of your friends of your friends of your friends at the bottom. And so candidates will know that often that they can't really trust those people. So it's quite a gamble distributing, because the money is going through a lot of hands, and so a lot of it gets lost. And then again, of course, some voters are receiving payments from more than one, or they receive the payment and it's just, I'll or they don't reciprocate. So there's a lot of ways that you can lose votes along that way. I think that was, did we cover everything?
Okay, next round. So Michelle, Chris, and sorry. Please, thank you. Michelle's a student here at Wagner, and this is a little promo along with Anda. They have a project, Race to Astana, and their third podcast, I just got an email while we were talking, is out today. So look at Race to Astana.
Yes.
Michelle.
Don't forget to do that. But to your point about strengthening political parties, I think another thing is also about strengthening ideologies, because I feel like political parties in Indonesia are very similar. Maybe right after the New Order, it's a little bit more polarizing because at the time, PDI is the opposition of the Suharto, and they're very different. But later on, they became really, really similar. And then I feel like people would be just like, oh, if they're the same, then we'll just vote for who we know, or who will give the most money, or who will help us the most. That's my experience with elections in Indonesia ever since I remember. And we can also see this in politicians jumping political parties all the time. Like a former governor in Sulawesi, where I'm from, he was with the Democrat, and then he moved to PDIP, and then it was Ahok. Even Ahok was also, he was in many different parties. So I think they also see political parties as simply vehicles because there's no clear differences in ideology, and I think it's a problem. It could cause polarization, as you said, but I think if people can see that there are differences in voting for candidates from different parties, this clientelism, like exchange of services and goods, could be transformed. That's a theory.
Yep.
Chris?
I had two questions from the opposite ends of the spectrum. You talked about the cost of the election. What's the profit of the election? Does anybody put numbers on that? So how much do you stand to make by becoming the Bupati or becoming the governor? So if you're going to invest 2.5 million, is there an expected rate of return? Because I've seen people in North Maluku who were just sort of your average bureaucrats in Perikanan, and now they spend their summers in France, right? Because they're just worth an absolute fortune. And so I'm wondering if do people know that? And then if the rate of return is higher in, say, someplace like North Maluku, where you've got gold mines and nickel mines, versus someplace like, I don't know, Sumba, where there's nothing. Right? I'm sure there's something in Sumba. Sorry. And then another question is on the other end of the spectrum, is you guys talked a lot about, you were hanging out with politicians, and you were hanging out with their boosters, and you had your expert studies. What about just your regular Joe Q umum, just your regular guy on the street, your peasant, your kaki lima, whatever, somebody who is just voting if they vote? What do they, the rates of return seem pretty bad, but what are their thoughts on this, or how do they choose how to vote, and what's the role in that? And then the third quick question, which I'm sure everybody wants to know, the guy with the notebooks and the note-taking, did he win or lose? Yeah.
He did win.
He did win.
He's now chief accountant for something.
And sorry, are you?
Yeah.
Also a student here at Weather.
First year, still new. First, I'm gonna touch a little bit about your opinion on the social media and hoax around the election. Especially right now, we're almost presidential elections next month, I think. Yeah, I already got the paper. But right now, I've been following the election pattern also back in my home country. I'm Indonesian. And mostly the social media and the hoaxes that concerning elections are touching a more sensitive area, which is religion. When I look at the news, there's always one headline that says, another hoax regarding religion. Always. There's one time I saw a news about an area, which I don't remember where, they refuse to command the azan. Azan is like a calling for prayer for Muslims. If you don't vote for this candidate, which I thought it was very rude. But I also have a personal experience on this. I once went to an Idul Fitri prayer, and the imam actually touched a lot of political area in his speech on an Idul Fitri, which I thought was come on. But in your research, I know you touched a little bit about religion. Was it significant, the religious stuff actually affect democracy or election? Is it really significant, or is it more about the money? And second is, it's a little different. This is actually intriguing, especially on the second part of the conclusion. Right now, we also see a lot of rising of non-partisan ministers, like Ministry of Finance, Sri Mulyadi. She's not coming from any party. She's an expert. Susi Pujiastuti, Ministry of Fisheries. She's a businesswoman in fisheries. Does this mean that it's actually making the parties less strong to achieve the highest power, which is the ministry seats?
Great, thank you.
Right, you go first. You go first? Do I cherry pick now? So let me go back. Who did we start with? Sorry, with Michelle, right?
Yes. Ideology.
Oh yes. So thanks for your question, Michelle. Yeah. So strengthening ideology. So this gives me an opportunity to talk about a different paper that I've done with my colleague there, Eve Warburton. We actually did a survey of DPRD members, so provincial parliamentarians from around the country, and one of the things we asked them was about their all sorts of questions related to policy and ideology of their parties, like where do you locate your party in terms of the role of the state versus the role of the market, supporting entrepreneurship, welfare for the poor, and so on and so forth. And what came out of that survey is really clear, actually, that the parties are not differentiated on ideological grounds in any of the traditional measures of a left-right continuum that you would find in like European countries or Latin America and so on. But they are differentiated quite significantly on the role of religion. So that's the only thing that really differentiates parties. So it goes back to this question about unintended consequences, that party strengthening reforms are likely to increase religious polarisation in elections as well. So something to think about. Maybe I'll leave Chris's questions to you. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. The role of religion. How significant then was religion in election campaigns? Sort of interesting question, hard to answer succinctly, but one thing I would say is it's less significant than you would think, right? That often, even candidates of religious parties that we often encountered, like even the most religious parties like PKS and P3, when you interview them, they say, yeah, of course, that they speak in an Islamic idiom, that they rely significantly on religious networks, but they feel that they have to adapt to the standard pattern of politics. So they're also establishing success teams, they're distributing goods and so on. And often I remember very clearly one DPR member from P3 in Tangerang, for example, who said, yeah, you know, we talk about ideology, but that's not really what it's all about these days. And then he's just talked about what his day-to-day campaigning was, and it was all meeting community groups and giving money for this, money for that, helping, you know, a village hall, you know, all sorts of different things. And the other thing is that a lot of candidates, because every candidate is on the lookout for social networks that are influential at the community level, my impression is that there's a sort of an instinctive feeling among many candidates that, well, of course, Indonesians are very religious, they listen to religious leaders, so we will go through religious networks. You get so many candidates who try to work through Majelis Taklim and similar sort of, you know, pengajian groups, you know, all that sort of stuff. But this is not scientific, but my impression is that a lot of those candidates fail, actually, that they try to go through the religious groups as a shortcut, they use them to distribute goods or gifts. But often religious brokers are not that influential, actually. The people you really want to get on side are people who have the legitimacy to speak on behalf of the community and who voters really know that they'll need in their future. So that's people like village heads, or even like airway sort of heads, those sorts of people. Or, you know, even the head of like a kelompok tani, you know, a farmers cooperative. These are the group organisations or networks people depend upon for their livelihoods. So my impression is, I mean, the other thing to say about this, of course, is that the religious networking often simply goes hand in hand with the clientelistic politics. So you might get a candidate who's more religious, and that candidate simply uses like NU or kelompok pengajian to distribute their goods, and they might be a bit distinctive in that they're handing out religious paraphernalia rather than t-shirts or ashtrays or whatever it is, but it's really the same form of politics, but just in a different guise.
Thank you.
Sorry, I probably believe you.
No, that's nice. Maybe I'll start building on what you just said. To me, that element of the presidential elections that we now have about whether Prabowo knows how to say the right prayer or whether Sandi is really religious enough and all that, it actually seems to me to be a product of the way in which the kind of system that we discussed hollows out any kind of ideological politics. That's what, connecting to your question as well, that because you have weak political parties and because so much of political interaction revolves around material exchanges, there's not enough ideological development and of candidates developing a distinctive policy views and campaigning on that, which just leaves a void that you need to talk about something during election campaigns, and then it comes around these very symbolic or these very things like a contest of who's most religious, which is actually just because there's too little else to really talk about. In that light, I really sympathize with Michelle's point. I mean that ideology of political parties is often lacking, and I think, I hope that if parties would be strengthened, also their profile and their power, you would at least have an avenue for strengthening that. Related to Chris's question, the profits of elections, that's interesting and something we didn't really get into. When you asked that in the expert survey the question about how much candidates spent during elections, we saw a huge variation, and not surprisingly, the highest amounts of money were spent in East Kutanegara in East Kalimantan, which is also the richest area where there's a lot of oil and mining, and so where indeed the profits are highest in politics because of the character of politics, and the character of the economy, and the lowest estimated spending was in NTT somewhere, where basically you have a little bit of agriculture but not much else. So where there are less lucrative economic activities going on that you could siphon off and get money from. I think there is a strong correlation between the character of the economy and how much candidates are willing to spend, because they make that assessment of how much profit they would be able to get afterwards. It's just not something, of course, that candidates would speak of, about how much would the profit be and how they actually calculate. I didn't come across, but it would be actually interesting to look at.
So it sounds like nobody's actually running for office because they want to make Indonesia a better place. They're running for office because it seems to be a good way to get wealthy very quickly.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. That is too simple. I think there are candidates for whom running for office is a business strategy, indeed, and there are these family mafia coalitions that we see in Kalimantan and elsewhere, where basically you send one family member to run for office so that the other family members can have their business opportunities. So that is there. But at the same time, there are candidates truly idealistic who are more, for pragmatic reasons, feel forced to compromise their ideals and engage in vote buying because they know they wouldn't get elected. So the other way around. What?
Do the idealistic ones win?
Sometimes. And I mean, we do have these stories of people like Risma or Ridwan Kamil, who do have an idealistic streak and who are not. I mean, who also engage in these practices. I think, but I think so. And I think it's not coincidence that those names and those people are often found in Java, where, as we argue in the last part of the book, the economic conditions are more conducive to those kind of candidates to win and to come up. I think in Kalimantan or East Indonesia, they might be there but less likely to win. because of that concentrated control economies there. But in Java, they are there.
I mean, like Ridwan, I think Ridwan refused, I think it was Garindra the second time, that I think because he didn't want to play the money politics, and he thought, he had enough profile he needed.
Yes.
So.
Well, so in our book we discuss Risma's difficulties, because it's actually an interesting story. She, out of a fight between party bosses, she was kind of like, came out like, then you run. And then she didn't want to play along, which she got a vote of no confidence 3 months after being elected.
That's right.
Because basically these party bosses put a paper on her desk and saying, we want those guys to be promoted, they are our bureaucrats, they need to be promoted. She refused to, and she also refused some other projects that the party bosses were counting on for money.
That's how Jokowi, when he won his solo the first
Exactly.
time, he fired everybody.
But then the interesting thing is that she was saved because of a kind of a media and civil society campaign who rallied around her. And that was possible, I would say, because of the economic conditions, that you would have that network and an open, free press that could protect her. And that would not be possible in Kalimantan.